Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video I'm still continuing my analysis into national security affairs, specifically intelligence analysis. My analysis is guided by this book, the Oxford Handbook to National Security Intelligence, superb resource. You'll need that book in order to effectively participate in the lecture series. Also the notes that I've compiled, which are growing, you can access by clicking the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Just download the PDF, follow along. Today I'm going to continue the analysis. I'm in the middle of a section, so I'm on page 7 of my notes. So just go to page 7, look on the notes. You'll notice it says intelligence as a set of missions. That's what we'll be doing today. We are in, let me just make sure I'm right, 6. We are in section 1.1. Okay. So we are in section 1.1. Still, wait, hold on, let me make sure. Oops, section 1.1. Alright, so let's begin. So this is national security. And this is intelligence. This is section 1.1. We are in the middle of page 7 at the section headline, Intelligence as a Set of Missions. Okay, so this is a relatively short bit that we'll conclude section 1.1 and then we'll move on to section 2, which begins at the top of page 8. So, intelligence as a set of missions. Okay. So that the idea is, there are 4 forms, according to the text, there are 4 forms of covert action, and the idea is to look at what these forms of covert action are. Now, in all due respect, I'm not going to go into the level of depth or complexity that each of the 4 forms requires, simply because it's an overview. It's more important for a general understanding, at least initially, of the content information, that we have precisely that, the understanding, right? A good conceptual framework. I might contribute a little bit of depth to it, but I'm not going to spend any significant amount of time on this. So, 4 forms of covert action. And the first one is propaganda. Propaganda. To be honest with you, this year was the first year I hadn't heard of Edward Bernays, his book, Propaganda. And I think it was earlier this year, maybe in March, February, somewhere around there, that I had finally stumbled across his work. It's a very short read. It took me like 2-3 days to go through the book. I think I got the e-book, and I just read it, the e-version. So I went through and I'd heard, obviously, of the word propaganda. I know what propaganda is, but I never studied Bernays directly, and it was rather ingenious, the approach, right? This is sort of the foundation for marketing relations and public relations specifically. In terms of covert action, though, you wouldn't inherently think that propaganda is a means for covert action. And without getting into a large-scale discussion of precisely what entails propagandization, you'll remember that maybe an hour or so ago in the lecture series, I was talking about the role and the function of the entirety, right? The role and the function of the entirety of the intelligence community can be one of propagandizing if certain conditions apply. And the question is, what are those conditions that need to apply in order to legitimize this notion of propagandization, right? So the question becomes the necessary conditions, if you will, for propaganda. Okay, so what are the necessary conditions for propaganda? I don't have this in the text directly, I wanted to consolidate space. And a lot of this, for those of you who, we're now in hour 5. We're approaching We've completed 4 hours. We're moving towards the 5th hour. So we're a good ways into the lecture series. So now I can get a little bit more technical with sort of my approach pedagogically, or andragogically to be technical. The idea is, what I do is construct a lecture so that it's formatted to directly, almost one-to-one, correlate with the book that I'm using. And then from there, based on my own experience, based on my own reading, based on all the knowledge that I have, I fill in the gaps. So this is that. This is filling in the gaps. It's not going to be necessary that you memorize or you have a complete understanding at this stage of what I'm saying, but it is important that you have a general understanding of what's being said. And this will require you to have been attentive in the previous 4 hours. So the question is, what are the necessary conditions for propaganda? How is it constructed? You'll remember that we said in terms of the intelligence cycle and the ability to construct the deliverable with which we pass this information on to the policymakers. If it's the case, right, so it's a conditional, and this is just one aspect, right, there are many, many ways to do this, right, it's a conditional. Just really quick, anytime you see this arrow, to the left of the arrow is if, to the right of the arrow is then, and this then is the consequence. This is what we're going for. If this happens, then what happens? It's a conditional relationship, at least at this general level. If it's the case that we identify a piece of, let's just say, like a pamphlet, to keep it simple. We identify a pamphlet as a piece of propaganda, then the question becomes, how do we go about doing that? How do we go about making that identification? Right? How is it that we go about identifying something as a piece of propaganda? The first thing to recognize, without getting too deep, is that what you are seeing, what you are reading, what you are hearing, the presentation has more complexity, right? There's more complexity to the content information than what is specifically being presented, right? So that's the first point. I'm not going to write all of that down. I'll just put more complexity. Right? The presentation of information has more complexity than simply what is being presented. Now, granted, you can complicate this analysis with talking about different ways for the presentation of information via communications theory and the context with which we talk and the context with which our language is framed, but I'm not going to get into that. You could also complicate this even further by talking, I've talked about that, spoken about that in a different series. You can talk about also the role of semiotics, more importantly, and the relationship between the words that we say and the concepts or the intent that they are directed towards, right? So if I say something and I present information for, and I'm trying not to give examples, I'm trying to keep this very, very general so that you can make your own appropriations in terms of meaning, but the idea should be clear. And always tell me if I'm going too fast or it becomes a little too abstract, because I'm comfortable in the abstraction. But the idea is, if I am presenting information that I know is more complex than than is perceived, I'm presenting information which I know is more complex than it is perceived, there is a likelihood, and this is a guarantee in propaganda, that certain segments of the population will understand what's not being explicitly stated, right? And what I can do then is I can function under the guise of the presentation. So that functionally speaking, and this is critically important, right? Functionally speaking, when we're talking about propaganda, the efficiency of propaganda is the functioning under the guise. I am functioning under the guise that I am a charitable person. I am functioning under the guise that my work here is humanitarian in nature. I'm functioning under the guise, fill in the blank. So that's one aspect. So I'll put that here. That's one aspect. The next aspect, and as I said, I'm not going to do a lot more. I can discuss tremendous amounts more, but I want to keep it sort of simple. Now, the next thing that we recognize is that propaganda really is, and this is probably more important than the other 2 points depending on who you speak with, propaganda really is a means of influence. It's affective.